Last week we discussed the general market cycle that just about every market and, dare I say, every investment goes through at some point or another. For those who missed that video, we basically found that there are 4 primary stages of a market cycle: accumulation, markup, distribution, and markdown. The accumulation phase sees the more bold and speculative investors, and possibly some value investors who spy a deal, start to re-enter the markets following a recent downturn. As a result, the free fall begins to slow, but not necessarily enough for the media and general investing community at large to believe that the worst is officially over, especially in light of other economic indicators that are out there at the time. The markup phase sees a shift in outlook as more investors gradually start jumping back onto the bandwagon, and greed slowly begins to overcome fear. Eventually, this reaches a tipping point and sellers begin to dominate the market in the distribution phase. This is where we tend to see the most volatility in the markets, as they can jump up and down wildly for a few days, weeks, or even months, possibly even setting new all-time highs in the process, before eventually starting to free fall into the 4th and final phase of the cycle. But that isn't the only cycle that markets are said to go through. Far, far from it. There's many more. But since it's election season, I've been finding myself thinking a lot more about one of those cycles in particular: the presidential election cycle. The presidential election cycle is the theory that gets brought up every 4 years or so here in the States, and basically says that the markets will generally experience lower returns during the first 2 years of a president's term. The 3rd and 4th year of the term will see considerably higher returns as a result of the president trying to give the economy a boost to help further the efforts of their re-election campaign. At least so the theory goes. So I thought that, as a fun aside from all the political discussions we've been hearing recently, we'd take a few minutes to analyze this theory and see how accurate or inaccurate it has been historically. To do that, we'll be focusing on a couple of key metrics. The first and most obvious is the inflation-adjusted returns of the market during each presidential term. We'll be looking all the way back to 1929 and the start of President Herbert Hoover's term to get our return figures today. The other metric is, at least to me, for the purposes of this theory, probably even more interesting, which is how often the presidential incumbent actually got re-elected in relation to the recent performance of the markets. Because I would expect to see higher re-election rates in situations where the final 2 years or so of the president's term were economically successful, if this theory is true. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to my Patreon page. This is the best way to show your support for this channel, and in addition to that, you can also get early access to new videos and exclusive content such as spreadsheets based off the ideas we discuss in these videos. The spreadsheets will allow you to play with your own numbers and see how big of a difference some of the ideas we discuss can make for your own personal financial situation. First, let's look at the inflation-adjusted returns of election cycles, since that is really the crux of this theory. Since President Herbert Hoover took office in March 1929 and until June of 2020, as that's the most recent completed month I have available to me at the time of this writing, the average yearly inflation-adjusted returns of the S&P 500 was about 4.7%. That sounds a lot lower than the numbers we hear in a lot of other videos, including the ones on this channel, and the reason that is I'm merely looking at the raw S&P 500 index, so these returns do not include any dividends at all. I'm doing it this way this time so that we can keep our focus merely on the growth in the overall markets, as opposed to what an investment earning those dividends and reinvesting them would grow to during that time. The median return is a fair bit higher at 7.1% per year. If we look at every half-term span, we see that the average return was around 9% and the median was around 10%. So if this presidential election cycle theory is true, we would expect to see returns typically hovering at or below the 9% mark on average, with the middle-of-the-road scenarios being under 10% in those first 2 years of the presidential term, before seeing the scenario flip in the second half of the administration. But is that what we actually see? Well, as it turns out, yes. During the first 2 years of a presidential term, the average growth in the market clocks in at around 5%. With the median hovering at around 7.3%, both of which are noticeably lower than the overall numbers. In the second half of the administration, we see those figures jump quite considerably, with the average growth being 13.2% and the median being a whopping 17.1%. So quite a big difference. Admittedly, we are dealing with a small sample size here, so we do have to take this all with a grain of salt, but it is still interesting. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the second half of a presidential term is more likely to beat out the first than not. Because while both the average and the median returns during the second half of a term are higher than in the first half, of the 22 full terms that we've gone through from 1929 through 2016, Trump's current one being still up in the air at the time of this writing, only 11 of them have had better second halves than first halves. So literally, coin flip odds to this point. What's more is that when you dig into the numbers, it becomes clear that the rise and fall in the growth of the market is anything but perfectly timed to presidential races. Ideally, if you're the acting president and you're trying to prop up the market at the end of your term in order to boost your chances at getting reelected, you want the bulk of the growth to come at the end of your term in year 4. However, that's not always what happens, according to the dataset. In the first year of a president's term, the average growth of the market usually hovers at around 5%, with the median trailing it slightly at about 3.8%. In year 2, the numbers drop to an average of 0.9% and a median of negative 4.1%. That makes actually kind of perfect sense according to this theory, as in the first year you still may be experiencing some residual effects of some of the moves made by the former president at the end of their last term. But perhaps by the second year those effects will have become more muted, and any sacrifices that the current president makes will take over, leading to a less than stellar second year. However, the third year surprises us a bit, as it is, historically speaking, far and away the strongest year economically for the markets according to this dataset. The average growth in the market clocks in at around 10.9%, with the median slightly higher at 11.8%. And it's pretty remarkably consistent as a year as well, with roughly 80% of them at least keeping pace with inflation. The fourth year is still respectably strong, but not quite as strong as the third. Its average and median returns are 1.9% and 7.3% per year respectively, so it falls behind the first and third years on average and just barely edges out the first year of a term for second best in the median return category. The reason its average is so much smaller than the median is because even the best fourth years are not usually all that impressive. The best fourth year of a president's term since 1933 was in 1936, with FDR sitting in the Oval Office. The market had risen by roughly 26% from the previous year, and FDR was, of course, reelected. But unlike in the first, second, and third years, we didn't really have many good contenders for that first place spot. The next best fourth years were in 1996 and 1976, with growth figures of 17 and 12% respectively. To put it into more perspective, the best first, second, and third years saw growth of 88%, 44%, and 66% respectively. All three of those years had a second best of over 28% growth. So yeah, there's quite a big gap there, which is odd considering that you'd think a president would want to have as much growth leading into an election as humanly possible. So on the whole, this suggests to me that, as interesting as the presidential election cycle theory is, I don't think that the president as an individual has enough influence over the broader economy and markets that they're able to control when it peaks. If they did have that level of influence, I think we'd see much better performances coming from that fourth and final year in office, and a much higher than 50% success rate in the second half of terms. But there's just too many moving pieces and other variables for that to be the case. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't try to boost the economy heading into an election, it just means that it won't always work as well as they'd hoped. And as such, it isn't something that I would be considering too closely when formulating my investing strategies. With that being said, let's move on to the second portion of this video and look at re-election success to see if there is any correlation between the broader economic and market performances in election years and who gets sworn in January. So as I said earlier, since 1929 there have been 22 full election cycles. We're once again excluding the upcoming election as we don't yet know how it'll turn out. Of those 22, 6 have seen someone other than the current president running for office, either because the president had already served his 2 terms, chose not to run again, or for one reason or another was incapable of running again. Of the remaining 16 elections that saw the current president try to stay in office, 11 succeeded. Those 11 who did succeed were FDR in 1936, 1940, and 1944, Harry Truman, who took over for FDR after his passing in the 1948 election, Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956, Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over for JFK after his passing in the 1964 election, Richard Nixon in 1972, Ronald Reagan in 1984, Bill Clinton in 1996, George W. Bush in 2004, and of course Barack Obama in 2012. The 5 who failed were Herbert Hoover in 1932, Harry Harry Truman in 1952, though his situation was a little different, Gerald Ford in 1976, Jimmy Carter in 1980, and George H.W. Bush in 1992. As for the economic and market conditions leading into those elections, there actually does not seem to be any real good pattern developing. As we know, the market did fall quite a bit in the early 1930s before Hoover's failed re-election campaign. And the market did grow by 66% in 1935 and an additional 26% in 1936 before FDR was re-elected. However, it fell by 4% in 1939. And an additional 14% in 1940, leading into FDR's second successful re-election. His third re-election did see the markets growing again by 12 and 11% in years 3 and 4. But we were also in the thick of World War II in 1944 when that election happened, so that certainly played a role. When Harry Truman was elected after serving as the president in FDR's stead, the market was coming off back-to-back down years, falling by 18 and 11% in 1947 and 1948. And Truman actually withdrew from the presidential race early in 1952 after losing his primary, despite the market being up in all 4 years of his term. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was re-elected, the market was coming off of a strong couple of years, with 44% growth in 1954, 27% growth in 1955, and a below average, but hey, still positive 2% growth in 1956. So we'll chalk that one up in favor of the theory. Lyndon B. Johnson served as president in 1964 when the markets grew by 11%, which certainly didn't hurt his campaign, but similar to Truman, he pulled out of the 1968 race early despite back-to-back positive years in the markets leading up to his election. Nixon rode a solid fourth year of growth into a successful re-election in 1972. However, Gerald Ford, who took over for Nixon after the Watergate scandal, failed in his bid for election in 1976, despite 20 and 12% growth in the markets in the third and fourth year of that term. Of course, similar to FDR's administration during World War II, they had some serious extenuating circumstances coming into play during that particular election cycle. Jimmy Carter's bid for re-election failed in 1980, despite, again, back-to-back years of growth leading into that race. And while Reagan did see above-average growth in the third year of his term, the real growth in year 4 was actually negative. Despite that, he was re-elected anyway. George H.W. Bush was beaten out by Bill Clinton in 1992, despite seeing 21% growth in year 3 and a below-average but still positive level of growth in year 4 of his term. Clinton's campaign had much stronger growth in 1995 and 96, and he was re-elected. A similar story could be told about George W. Bush in 2004, though unlike Clinton, he did also have the dot-com crash take place early in his first term. And finally, Barack Obama had to deal with the Great Recession for much of his first term, but by the end he was seeing solid growth again, to the tune of roughly 10% in his fourth year. So what we're seeing is that roughly half the time someone who is trying to get re-elected has an economy that's doing great over the previous year or two, and the other half has an economy that's underperforming. And the success rate of the re-election campaign doesn't seem to change much either way. Again, that's not to say that the economy and markets have no bearing on the outcome of an election, because of course it does, but it's a single part of a much, much larger whole. So in the end, is the presidential election investing cycle a real thing or not? Well, it's difficult to say given how small the sample size is. There certainly does seem to be a difference in both the average and median returns during the first and second half of a president's term. However, the first half of the term has been the superior half just as often as the second. It's just that the second halves that were superior won that battle by a wider margin to drag those average and median figures up. Despite that, it certainly isn't something that I would be building an entire investing strategy around, as to this point there just doesn't seem to be enough conclusive evidence to suggest that you'd be better off investing that way over the long run. And while the performance of the economy leading up to an election no doubt plays some role in the outcome, it's just one of many variables that goes into making that decision. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.